let's look at the Ordo Salutis for the Molinist. How does it compare to the Calvinist and Arminian Ordo Salutis? Here we have a blank page. And you might ask, well, why is it a blank page? Because the Molinist Ordo Salutis does not exist. It does not exist. The order of salvation doesn't exist. Why is it that Molinism doesn't have an Ordo Salutis? Here is the answer why, and this is where I will start my criticism. And when I say that Molinism doesn't have an Ordo Salutis, that's not a critique, that's not a dig. The reason why there is no proper Ordo Salutis in order of salvation, like what you see with Calvinism and Arminianism, is because Molinism is not a distinct model of salvation. Molinism is a distinct model of divine foreknowledge. One could hold to the Arminian facts, the acronym. One could be an Arminian and be a Molinist. At least logically speaking, one could be a Calvinist and a Molinist. Now, the Calvinists might find themselves disagreeing with the historical Reformed view of divine foreknowledge, but nevertheless affirm the Molinist framework of divine foreknowledge while simultaneously affirming the tulip. Those, in my mind, are logically compatible. And this is also why philosophers have been thinking about these deep theological truths and arguing about these deep theological truths in the philosophical realm, while the theologians have tended not to engage with Molinism all that much. Now, I think that's unfortunate on the theologians' part, because Molinism is an appealing solution to some on the issues of divine sovereignty and human free will. But again, you could be a Molinist and be an Arminian. For example, William Lane Craig identifies as a Wesleyan, which is a subcamp of Arminianism, and he's a Molinist. So you can see here that Molinism doesn't fit as a proper model of salvation when we think of the order in which how an individual joins the Christian church, when, at what moment does that individual receive divine grace? What is that order of operations? What is the order of salvation? So Molinism is not a distinct model of salvation, but it is a distinct model of divine foreknowledge. And perhaps there are strengths to affirming it as a model of divine foreknowledge. But we don't want to make a category error by bringing Molinism over into this theological debate on sin and salvation, which is where the debate is happening between the Calvinists and the Arminian. If you were to think that Molinism is a solution to the competing views of Calvinism and Arminianism, it's not. It's not a solution. It's a solution to divine sovereignty and human freedom, but it doesn't answer for us what the nature of man is, how God elects individuals. You can still hold to unconditional election, or you can hold to conditional election, because the Molinist could affirm either. So let's keep moving along with some of my feedback, my criticism. One of the most popular objections to Molinism is one that I also find agreement with. That is called the grounding objection. And essentially, it is encompassed with this question: what makes it true that an agent A, or person A, would do action X in circumstance C? What makes that statement true? What gives it grounding to reality? And thus, how does God, via middle knowledge, know these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom? So I think that's a good concern, contrary to Molinism. There's another question about whether Molinism retains a sufficient amount of human freedom. Does the Molinist succeed in preserving libertarian free will? I'm also not persuaded that that's the case. I know I've got plenty of Molinist friends that are big libertarians. I know the responses. I simply continue to find myself unsatisfied with some of those responses. So one of the most common responses to the grounding objection would be that we would be talking about closest possible worlds. A concern I have over this idea of that truth being in the closest possible world to the actual world. There's a couple objections there. How would God know which one is the closest possible world to the actual world? How does that work? But also that requires God to have knowledge of the actual world. So it seems, in a sense, a bit circular. That's another concern. The Molinist will, in some cases, dare I say, punt, that might be offensive to my friends, to brute facts, that it just is this way. And that I haven't found satisfying either. The Bible describes God's knowledge of counterfactuals. We went over those scriptural passages. It seems inevitable that God does have that knowledge. The answer to the question, how does God have the knowledge of counterfactuals? It remains open. One does not need to affirm middle knowledge in order to believe that God does have knowledge of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. There might be some other way, some other means by which God acquires or has this knowledge. The Calvinist, for example, could say that God simply knows these counterfactuals because God would orchestrate, bring these circumstances about. That is an option available to the Calvinist. The option available to the Arminian is that God has this knowledge at the moment of creation. When God actualizes the world, that's how God knows these truthful propositions of counterfactuals that we see in Scripture. So again, God's knowledge of counterfactuals that we see in Scripture does not require us, it's not predicated upon middle knowledge, properly speaking.